We can pause you here, reply.
To add a little bit, yeah, to my background, hold on, let's see, okay, continue. Yeah, I spent my career as an intelligence officer and primarily human intelligence. And the focus there is really how you transfer information, how you elicit, how you communicate, how you negotiate. And it's applicable across a broad range of endeavors. But I will tell you, an epiphany for me occurred really kind of the mid-aughts, the mid-2000s, when I had a chance to start working very rigorously with behavioral scientists. And I look back at many of the techniques and protocols I was taught, and I think in terms of what we're going to talk about today, memory, I think we're in the dark ages. And you know, when I talk to all sorts of practitioners as well as working with researchers, and some practitioners are open to the idea of getting better. Some are focused exclusively on an outcome. And in the law enforcement world, unfortunately, that is a confession, regardless of the circumstance. But it violates a fundamental, I think, principle. I'm going to mention this in my presentation, and that is, you know, the role of memory. That's where the information resides. So I'll go ahead and get started so we have plenty of time. If there's any questions in the middle, please, I don't know if we can facilitate those, I hope so, but please, you know, let it be known that you have a question, and we'll press forward.
Sure, I'll monitor. If people have a question, just go ahead and raise your hand on the side, or just send me a chat, and I'll ask Steve.
So what you see here now is, don't worry, we're not going to go into this, but this is a model for elicitation that Dr. Chris Meissner, who's a cognitive psychologist at Iowa State and one of the leading researchers in the world on investigative interview and interrogation. This is probably a decade of research and replication and updates with science moving forward. And you can see here at the very bottom, this is where the cognitive interview comes in as part of the strategies. And our strategies are not focused on persuasion or compliance, but really how you enhance memory and use evidence properly to get to the fundamental goal, which we have as truth. So let's begin by talking about kind of the basics, if you will. You know, the principal goal, and this is something I try to emphasize as much as possible, no matter what audience, whether it's an Army counterintelligence or Los Angeles Police Department or FBI, the principal goal of interviewing is to elicit accurate and complete information. And I like to get them, by the end of a week, to be thinking about their job, if you want to describe it in the most succinct fashion. You know, a cocktail party discussion is, what do you do for a living? Well, I search for truth. And that's what it is. It's trying to find the truth, not confirming your own truth, but rather, and often a very, very complex environment, getting more information that helps you put things into context and hopefully draw a much better and more accurate assessment of the facts. And the key is, as I've already mentioned, in any interview, the information we want. And I asked this question, I said, where's the information we want? And it really stymies a lot of the students, you know, and these are practitioners sometimes with decades of research, or excuse me, of experience. You know, the information resides in the memory of an individual, and more specifically in the long-term memory, which presents incredible opportunities, but also a number of concerns that are completely overlooked in the conventional practice. So again, you know, memory presents that potential, but also these problems when you talk about it. Here's a little background. Just, you know, it's not going to be you know, we're not having a seminar on memory, but it's important to understand the fundamental elements, because memory is so misunderstood. We think of memory in terms of academic use, you know, remembering facts and figures and details, and we assume everybody else, their memory is perfect. And if, for practitioners, if somebody's memory isn't perfect, they're either resisting or they're lying or they're doing something nefarious. But I'll just go around these really quickly. So memory is not recall, it's reconstruction, which means there's partially some accurate recalls, but also putting into place context, when things happen, who else was there, and kind of drawing these logical conclusions. And that's in a situation where people want to recall to the best of their ability. But also, what you remember is what you encode, and what you encode is your experience. If all of us on this call walked into a bank to make a deposit and there was a bank robbery, and later on we were being interviewed, the only answers we have are our memories, and the only memories are things we saw, things we experienced, how those affected us, how it related to previous experience that we might have had. So memory is really just a reflection of our own experience, which is not the totality of reality. That's a good bumper sticker. And it's going to be incomplete. A lot of practitioners, again, assume if I ask, well, who was in the room? Now, I only remember 2 of them. What do you mean? We know there are 4 people. What are the other guys' names? I don't remember. That is natural recall. There are going to be gaps, and as a narrative is elicited, not only will those gaps sometimes be filled, often not, but also the information that has been offered will be changed, because as I mentioned down the lower left hand, memory is also associated. When you start thinking of a story, you think about the people, and the people remind you of other stories, and those stories remind you of events. And it goes on in this incredible network. And also, so the unique part is how we recall events most accurately is unique to each of us. If Marissa and I went on a business trip to New York City for 4 days, and we come back and somebody asks us, tell us all about it. Marissa may be a person who thinks of people, and she first describes all the people she met and what she learned from them. I may be, let's say, more chronologically oriented. And for me to get my memories out, I do it in that order. If you take Marissa and make her recall chronologically, and you ask me to start thinking exclusively about the people, I mean, this is just an example, our memories will not be clear, and they will not be as accurate, and certainly not as complete as possible. So that's another idea about why we really encourage open-ended questions in a narrative. And again, I'll get into more detail on that when we get into the nuts and bolts of the cognitive interview. And there's that, confabulation. We add facts, again, not being with an intention to deceive, but just trying to give the whole picture. For example, okay, this event occurred right after I thought that I dropped off my dry cleaning. And I first told the story was Monday because I remember for some, on Sundays it's closed. So it must've been Monday. It couldn't have been Sunday, that type of thing. Well, maybe the dry cleaning wasn't even connected with that day's events. But most importantly on here is how vulnerable it is. I mean, our memory can be shaped so easily. When I do this presentation, sometimes I'll talk about, and again, a lot of practitioners think their memory is 100%, so everybody else is, and theirs certainly is not. But I'll talk about, well, remember when that instructor came in and he had that pinstripe suit, right? Remember, and it had those yellow pinstripes. Yeah. Well, what was the color of the suit? And they'll get focused on that. Oh yeah, it was blue. So describe it. Yeah, it was blue with yellow pinstripes. And no, it was white pinstripes. My question changed their memory by saying, do you remember the yellow pinstripes? And these are practitioners, allegedly trained observers. So it's really, really vulnerable, which means how we ask questions is really, really important. A couple elements too about memory. And I think you'll see quickly the connection between memory in general and the application in an interview context. So, we can influence people to falsely recall. How? Present with false evidence. Have you ever heard that happening? I know that doesn't happen in this country, but I'm sure you've read about it in other countries, how, well, of course. We encourage them to doubt their memory, that maybe that's not the way it happened, Joe. Maybe actually, and you give these alternatives. Then you're asked, okay, well, just imagine, create this image in your mind that not the way you're saying it did, but imagine that you walked into that house and there was the guy and you thought he had a gun, that sort of thing. Those will significantly and sometimes permanently alter somebody's memory. Another thing is misinformation. Asking leading questions will cause people to answer a certain way. And once you answer, it begins to call into question the accuracy of your own recall. You don't have as much confidence. information provided by co-defendants or other witnesses or other victims. And then information from media reports. Did I actually see that, or did I read about it, or hear about it? And of course, today with the media being ubiquitous, we're pummeled literally with information that, and we kind of wonder where it came from. Did we have that experience, or was something else? So again, this is all about framework here. Let's talk about it. The key is, with any sort of questioning protocol, you want to have a system that allows you to consistently make reliable judgments about their credibility. And those are two important attributes. Consistently, over time, and they're accurate, they're reliable. Your assessment of their credibility is credible because you have objective foundation, not gut feel, or I've been doing this for 30 plus years, so I have a nose for deception, that type of thing. The other part is then having a way of questioning that can systematically distinguish between truthfulness and deception. And one of the ways of doing that is by understanding that truth tellers and deceivers have very, very different strategies to convince an interviewer that they're telling the truth. The first one's going to be fairly obvious. If you're telling the truth, you want to be not just be, but appear to be as open as you possibly can, as cooperative with the investigator as you can, and disclose as much information because you believe in the legitimacy, the reliability, the integrity of the criminal justice system. So you believe the more you disclose, the more quickly they're going to see that you're innocent. The problem is, for the interviewer, is deceivers have very similar, they want to appear to be open. That's the key, the appearance of being open, the appearance of being cooperative, but conceal information. Like, they'll go on and on with great detail about information that's not going to be a problem for them, but either trying to divert your attention away from, or minimize, or deny having information. So that's, in the far right, that's the difference. And that upon that has built a whole rash of literature based on research on how to detect deception, which we don't have time to go into. But cognitive interview, more recently, like when I say recently, the last few years, has started being used, or at least tested as a means of separating truth tellers from deceivers.
Steve, it's Marissa. I know we don't have a lot of time to talk about the deception, but I wonder if you could just briefly address what we're pretty familiar with, which is the nonverbal behaviors, and
Sure.
whether those are indicators of deception or not.
Absolutely. If there's one area of misunderstanding, or even more strongly, I'll put the myth, it's detecting deception. And the biggest one is nonverbal indicators of deception, meaning, communication takes place in a number of channels. There are, in fact, one researcher calls it gestures, cognitive offloading. It helps us to get the totality of our communication across beyond words and the tonality we use. But there's been intensive and long range research into whether somebody's grooming behaviors at a certain time, or gaze aversion, all these things. They find there's no correlation. No correlation whatsoever. In fact, a meta-analysis of all the best research out there, and I'll quote from it, it says that nonverbal indicators of deception are at best, quote, faint and unreliable. Faint and unreliable. They're difficult to even see if they're there, and they're not reliable indicators. But when I talk to law enforcement agencies, they have all sorts of them. If you ask somebody a fairly difficult question, one that requires some thinking or accessing their memory, and you're talking to them, and you're making eye contact, you ask them that question, the first thing they're going to do almost always is to look away, look up. They're not looking at anything, but they're no longer focusing on you or anything else, because it gives them more cognitive resources to go deep within either their memory or their executive functions to answer your question. So that's a normal thing. What they have found is when people who are deceiving, they often make more eye contact because they are watching you closely. They want to know are you buying this? Is this working, or I need to change my strategy? So what we do know from research is that, well, there's something we test with cognitive load, because to recall information requires a certain amount of resources that you have. So if we can get you to do more things at once, people, it's easier to recall a real memory. I mean, I can tell you about a trip to Yosemite. If I was making up the trip to Yosemite National Park, there's so much involved with that. I'm making it up spontaneously. Then I'm trying to remember what I said. I'm trying to put it together maybe with other events I didn't expect you to ask about. And it becomes very, very difficult. And so you find very few details. The story doesn't change over time, versus a real world example. If you told me, I would, again, the associative nature, I would probably, the second telling, my friend Jill, she actually came with us. I forgot about that because I haven't seen her in years. I'd be looking off into the distance to remember something. I might, scratch my head. So it's what we know from science about detecting deception, and what drives or informs practice are two very, very different things, which contributes to false confessions. Because when people don't believe another one's telling the truth, they're going to press and press and press until they get the answer they want, which is often a confession.
Thanks, Steve. I appreciate that.
So what we need to do, we need to understand the science about memory and how you can elicit the best memories. We need to understand the opportunities and the challenge that memory presents. And we need to design an elicitation paradigm that actually enhances memory. It doesn't do what conventional practice does, and that often corrupt or suppress memory. And that's what we have with several different approaches, but most notably the cognitive interview. It literally demonstrably enhances memory. The most recent studies have shown that when compared to direct questioning, a cognitive interview can increase a memory, even long-term memories of years and years ago, up to 90%, which is phenomenal. I mean, even early studies, when it was around 25-30%, for an investigation or anything else, that's very, very significant. But it's getting better and better. And this cognitive interview has been studied since, it's 30 years as the origins. A psychologist at UCLA began when somebody asked him after going to a party, did I leave my sunglasses there? No, and he was teaching memory. He started asking questions, which turned out to be sort of like a context reinstatement, which I'll explain. He had him go back through his day, and every time he did that, people said, oh, I remember they're at the office, or I remember they're in the car, or I remember I lent them to somebody. So again, talking a little bit more about the concerns. So research has repeatedly demonstrated law enforcement practitioners, they approach the individual in a way that does not maximize their ability to recall. They often ask closed questions, which, remember, going to our unique style of recall, you're asking me to remember the way you want me to remember. You want me to remember it in terms of, let's say, often in chronological order. And it's just, I can remember, if you give me time, I'll remember the whole experience, but I may start in the middle, then go to the beginning, then go to the end. It's just the way I recall. The other thing they do is they're constantly being interrupted. How many on the phone call today have not had the experience where you're telling a story, and it's an important story to you, and somebody interrupts, whether good-naturedly to ask questions or to share their story, and then they'll say, oh yeah, what were you saying? And you're thinking, I have no idea where I was. Complete loss. That thread, if you will, of memory was severed. And poor questioning design is probably one of the worst culprits. Again, how I shaped the question about the yellow pinstripes versus, there were white pinstripes. By asking that question, instead of asking what was the color, what was the design, that sort of thing, I put it into direct questions. Was it this or that? Was it? When you have questions that are just yes or no, you're going to limit their recall. You're going to limit their desire to accurately recall, and you're going to often overlook areas that you just had no information, no clue that they might have knowledge. So you miss that. And again, these misleading questions that just get people confused. And I think that's part of the strategy. What we've seen in Philadelphia and other major cities, Chicago, and in the military too. They think confusing an individual is going to break their resistance, when all it does is confuse everybody, and including those who are trying to be helpful. So the principal goal then of cognitive interview is to elicit accurate and complete information. As I mentioned earlier, to find the truth. And the truth may be, and this is where practitioners need to embrace the highest level of integrity, of standards of practice, in that you may have an incredible volume of strong evidence that seems to absolutely point to an individual's guilt. But if you really believe that and you have enough, why even talk to them? They always want this confession. Well, if you're looking for the truth, sometimes what appears to be very, very guilty information that would point to guilt is actually replaced by a very complex series of networks and connections that you now understand and realize, wow, this person is absolutely innocent, or it may lead to the actual guilty party. So looking for truth and having that sense of open-mindedness is just so important. So let me take you through the steps then. It seems kind of odd, and we get to some points where practitioners get very uncomfortable because many of them are, how to put it, their emotional intelligence could be developed further. They're uncomfortable with connecting with people. They're not really strong in areas of empathy or understanding. They get very, very cynical, and they want to push, and they also lack patience. So what we always do is introduce, since it's a different way of approaching, we introduce the cognitive interview. We'll explain, for example, how much research is behind it, and how it literally enhances people's ability to recall up to 90%. It's a very different way of doing things. And part of the key is, also, if I'm speaking to an individual, I am transferring absolute control of this to you. This is your story. You were there. I wasn't. I want you to share with as much possible detail so that I would feel that I was there. So that type of introduction, and the idea, again, describing how, okay, we're going to literally be able to enhance your recollection. And having taught it many years, sometimes I will sit as a subject. And I remember I'll pick a topic. I picked a topic of a survival exercise I took part in Korea in late 1980s. And they had me telling that story. Now, I hadn't even told the story in years. But as they went through it, I could not believe the amount of detail, the names of the people I was with, the faces, the order of events, some other things that I just literally hadn't thought of for decades. And I thought, and often we have practitioners practice the cognitive interview on each other so that they get that same feeling on the receiving end. They're just astonished how much more they can recall. We focus on the narrative, an open-ended story. This is their story without shaping the order, without shaping the limits. It borrows from motivational interviewing, which has been very effective in helping encourage change in behaviors. And it's not only for those in the addicted population, but one of my colleagues in Liverpool has done a decade of research of how it applies in the interrogation or interview context. But the idea of acceptance, this is your story, not mine. I'm not agreeing with anything you say, but I accept it. This is absolutely, like if you're giving me motivation for why you did something, I'm not going to condone it, but I'm not going to judge it either. So that acceptance, I'm going to adapt by letting you talk the way you want. And then, at some point I will follow up with other questions or have you focus on some areas. But the key is listening to that narrative. And then there are several forms of what we call mnemonics or memory devices beyond this narrative that we get. And for example, let's say they're telling me about an event that took place at a restaurant. They finished the narrative, and I'm always very thankful, and I always try to affirm what I want more of. I affirm I really appreciate your effort. I really appreciate the detail. I really appreciate your patience and pushing through this. But then I'll say, and I think we can. It's possible that we can add a little bit more, because we find that a sketch. It's an amazing way of connecting different parts of our memory and pulling out more. And a lot of times they'll say, well, I'm not an artist. And it doesn't, I said, it doesn't matter. I mean, if all you do is stick figures, you can take me through this. But the key is, I say, now, I want to be very clear when we're looking at the restaurant. Okay, we're going to look at it from, if I walked up to the hostess station, what would I see if I had walked into that restaurant at the hostess station and looked out over the dining room area? What would I see? A lot of people immediately start drawing an overhead, which is not what we want, because that's easy to sort of make up. And at the same time, a little bit more difficult sometimes for people who are actually there. But the people who are there will remember. I remember I walked up, and they can describe. You know, it was a high table. There was a lamp. There was a young lady about 22 years old. You know, and you're drawing all this. And that's the other part. You ask them to, as you're drawing, describe what you're drawing for me, because especially sometimes you won't be able to recognize it. Sometimes you'll be amazed. You find somebody with artistic skill, and it's phenomenal to watch them do that, at least for me, with very little artistic skill. But they start adding that associative. Well, here's the high desk, which was kind of interesting, because this young lady I think she was actually, gosh, probably 6 feet tall. She was quite tall for a female. And so, you know, we're gathering all this information, because these are all verifiable details we can go and check. And then over to the right, there were some plants, which kind of led you to, and it goes like this. And, you know, these are the people I saw at this table. You know, there was a sign for this and that. So we add more. And again, going back to the strategies of somebody who's telling the truth versus those who are deceiving. Those who are telling the truth are going to want to disclose as much as possible. Also, those who are telling the truth have an actual memory that this sketch will, and has been proven, to enhance somebody's memory. So if you have somebody telling the truth and doing this free narrative that they go on and telling, and then they go to the sketch, and there's every time we go through, there's no additional details, and the details are like a forest in the winter with all the leaves gone. It should be during the spring with lots of leaves, lots of details, lots of animals running through, the wind moving, and the other thing too is the cognitive load element of it. Trying to ask them to do more things. If I'm telling the truth, I can sketch and describe it at the same time. If I'm making it up, I'm making up my story and trying to sketch it as quickly as I can. And it's slower, it's a fumble, there's mistakes. I mean, really obvious mistakes. So then the follow-up, and here's the key is, you're going to have some follow-up questions. You're going to have areas you might want to go back and explore more. But a term that again, Dr. Meiser and I use, this is where you get into what we call constructive confrontation. There's ideas that, okay, what they said based on other information is just impossible. At least it appears to be an impossibility. So rather than the conventional approach, well, I got you now because that restaurant's closed on Tuesday and you said you went there, so you're a lion, whatever implied term you want to use. When in fact, this is when you say, okay, again, following from motivational interviewing, where you roll with resistance and you engage with them. And so a follow-up could be, again, an affirmation. I really appreciate the level of detail, but help me understand something, because I think I'm confused. You mentioned when you were talking earlier that you went to the restaurant and it was packed. You didn't think you were going to get a table. But then when you drew it, and I asked, we asked about the people, and it was very sparsely attended that night. Help me understand the difference. And a truth teller can give you a legitimate answer to resolve that. Somebody else, it's going to be it's not proof of their deception, but it's another indicator that perhaps what they're telling you isn't true. Another mnemonic then, and this one is surprising. People who are telling a true story, they could answer all sorts of surprise questions. Like here's an unexpected, they call it unexpected questions. If you told me about a vacation that you didn't go on. And maybe it's, you know, you're borrowing details from something else, or you saw a movie about it. I would accept your story, and then I might ask something like, that's interesting. So you and Mary went on this trip, yes. When did you and Mary decide to take this trip? Yeah, this preparation is not something, if you're planning a story, that's not something you plan to have. If it's the truth, you say, well, what was that? Oh, I remember we went to a movie and it was based in Paris and we decided we needed to go to Paris. Other people are going to fumble a little bit more. But so what we do now with the reverse order, though, is thank you very much for telling me the story. What I want you to do now is you told me you went to the restaurant where you left your home about 7 p.m. Yes, it was. Okay, 7. You got in your car and, oh, no, you're right. You said it was an Uber. So you took an Uber, you stopped by and picked up your friend and you went there and you got there around 8 o'clock. Yes, okay. So what I want you to do then is, you said you stopped for a while and visited at your friend's place before you got another Uber. Is that correct? Yes. What I want you to do now is tell me the events, take me through the events again of that evening, but I want you to start from when you left your friend's place to go to the restaurant back to when you left yours. So it's going to include, the visit with his friend and being in the Uber and that sort of thing, but go on in reverse order. And that's very difficult, but not difficult for a truth teller. You slow down, and that's the other part. You slow down and you have to focus on the moment. You have to almost go back and relive it. But you'll often find details that were missed because when you're telling a story, if you imagine going from left to right and you know where it's going, you sort of take shortcuts and you miss perhaps critical details. But reverse order, you slow way down. I've used this a number of occasions. Probably the most notable, I remember debriefing an LAPD undercover officer about there's a shooting that was involved. And he told me the narrative and so forth, but the reverse order, part of it was how he got into this house. And he said, okay, then he's leaving the house and okay, the door's closed and I ring the doorbell. He said, no, wait a second, I didn't ring the doorbell. I said, well, then how did anybody answer the door? That's a good question. And he thought about it. He said, you know what? I did not go through the front door. He remembered that he knocked, nobody answered, and he went around to the side. And it turned out to be a very critical piece. And he was he was kind of laughing after a while. He said, yeah, that's exactly what happened. But he told the story from beginning to end so many times, that point just got, because he'd gone to so many houses in life, he kind of had an amalgam of all these. Again, then at the end, you would develop any discrepancies. And that's what it is. Just there's a discrepancy. A and B could not happen at the same time. You can't be at home and at office at the same time. It can't be Monday and Tuesday at the same time. Help me understand that. And a truth teller will often, but not always, be able to help you work through that. Somebody who's not telling the truth, those discrepancies will just sort of stand out, and the answers will be nonsensical, and they'll be filled with details that are not verifiable. Let me go back to the introduction to the CI, enhancing recollection, and so forth. Here's the part that often feels uncomfortable, especially the first time they do that, because what we do is we want to get people into a place where they're willing. First, you have to get this. Only works with people who are going to be volunteers. Those who don't volunteer but pretend to, you'll see a very, very limited amount of, if any, new information obtained. But those who are actually putting themselves into it, the information yield will rise markedly. But the key is you want people to remember as comprehensively as they possibly can. So I'm just going to give you an example of the instructions. If one of you was sitting in front of me and I was asking you to do the cognitive interview. So I'd begin by explaining, we're going to try something that's probably very different, probably something you haven't seen. It's called a cognitive interview. And they call it that because it's based on what researchers know about how we recall, how memory actually works. There's a lot of misnomers about it, but we're able to apply what can literally and substantially enhance your ability to recall if you're willing to do this with me. So you get that buy-in. Yeah, I'll try it. Okay. So I'm going to ask you to tell me this narrative, because I've already asked an open-ended question and obtained the first narrative, but we're going to go deeper now. And I want you to cover the same material, the same periods, the same topics. But I want you to take your time, and I'm going to ask you to, if you're comfortable, to close your eyes. If you're not comfortable with that, maybe stare at a wall. But I just don't want you to have to focus on me, because I'm just going to sit here quietly. And my job is going to be nothing more than to listen without judgment, just to listen to everything you say and hear what you're trying to say with an absolute open mind. Your responsibility is to describe in such detail that I would feel like I was living it with you. So I don't want you to just tell me what you see, and I'll start slowing down my voice now. I want you to tell me what you saw, but also I want you to tell me what you heard. Tell me what you felt. Tell me what you smelled, and even perhaps tell me what you tasted. And in as much detail as possible. Now, don't feel like you need to fill in gaps. If there's a gap in your memory of this, or something's just very, very vague, or don't worry, that's just the way memory works. So don't feel any obligation to try to fill in gaps. They just naturally occur, and I understand that. And so again, we're going to go back and have you, this is your story. You were there, I wasn't. And when you're ready, if you want to close your eyes, that works really well. If not, you can look off in the distance, and you can begin when you're ready. And then also take as much time as you want, and let me know when you feel like you've exhausted your memory. And then we'll sit there, and they'll close their eyes. At first, people get uncomfortable, they'll look off in the distance, but once they close their eyes, they start getting very involved. Now, here's another element of detecting deception that my colleague Chris Meissner and some of his colleagues have been looking into, is even when the eyes close, when people are back there, they will start gesturing. They'll say, yeah, I remember there was this beautiful painting to the right, and they'll put their hand up and point to it. Or there was this really tall statue in the backyard, and they put their hands over their head. That is more indicative, not proof, but it's more indicative of somebody telling the truth. People who are making up stories, they weren't there. They don't have that tactile or visceral experience that they were trying to explain to you. So it's just words that they're making up. But then again, so I do this, and when they're done, I thank them, affirm the effort they've put in, affirm the detail they provided. Now, I will tell you that sometimes, like a couple of recent instances, you're taken back, let's say in a false confession case, an instance where somebody had, for whatever reason at the time, they had signed a statement or they'd made a confession that they knew at the time was false. They were led into, but they look back in time and they're really hard on themselves for maybe decades of their life were given up because of their decision at the time. And as they go back and live it, it can be very, very, very emotional. And that's where we need practitioners who are comfortable with that, who can sit knee to knee with some 6'5" man who is just absolutely sobbing, and never say or do anything that makes them feel judged or belittled, or just to recognize it, to find the words, the gestures, to recognize that you understand the depth of the emotion they're feeling, that it's understandable, and that you're with them. That takes a great deal of empathy, and it's not something they test for when people apply for the police force or the intelligence services, which they probably should. So that's kind of an overview of the CI. Sorry, I forgot that I had all these. I thought, I forgot to do this. I got into it. Let's see, I've pretty much covered all these things. I'll just go through real quickly. Yeah, again, slowing down and taking their time. And that's it. You don't want to interrupt them. You need to create a circumstance where somebody's not going to accidentally walk in the door, or there's not going to be noises outside, that people's phones are turned off, because again, to access memory requires what Cal Newport would call deep work, just really getting in there. And you interrupt it with a noise and unexpected, you're breathing, even breathing too heavily. You want to make the context as positive and as supportive of the memory as you possibly can. Talked again about having them see it, describe it as they see it, not from overhead, unless they're 7'11" or something. These follow-up, again, you can use, there's a certain amount of appropriate clothes because let's say it's important, the color of the car, and they keep talking about the car. They talk about the year, they talk about the model, they talk about the tires, they go into great detail. And maybe they thought that they've mentioned the color, but they never have. So at some point, it's appropriate to say, you told me about that car in great detail. I think you said it was a 1967 Mustang Fastback. And again, the discrepancy, help me out. I don't think you mentioned the color. Oh yeah, it was, and then they describe in great detail the color. So that's when you use, it's what we call appropriate closed-ended, but you end with those, you never begin with them. Again, talking about the closed eyes and start, and you take them through reverse order. Let's see. Yeah, the key is turn the discrepancy into the opportunity to learn more rather than a confrontation. And it's too easy to change the whole tone of a conversation or a relationship between an interviewer and a suspect by how you challenge those discrepancies. What, man, you don't believe me? He said, no, listen, I told you, this is your story. You were there. I'm not here to judge at all. I just don't understand. I don't understand how, this and this could happen. You always have to be aware of where the relationship is. I mean, we talked about two cycles. You have the information cycle and you have the relationship cycle, but they're integrated. How the quality of the relationship will correlate how much useful information you have, the type of information you have, and how you go after it will impact the relationship. Yep, that covered all those things. So again, the contrasting disclosure strategies. Truth tellers, who experience a cognitive interview, almost always will provide significantly more information because they can draw upon it. Those who are trying to be deceptive, it's more and more difficult for them to add detail. There are novel lies, and then there are adapted lies or displaced lies. Displaced lies are like me telling you, about my college experience, but I changed the college name, everything else I'm thinking about. But at some point, some questions, I'm talking about the name of the dormitory, which exists in my college and not in the other one. The deception will come to the surface. But that's the key, is looking for more information. In World War II, there was a program run by MI5 by the UK that were looking after trying to find every German intelligence officer, what they call the Abwehr, the Foreign Intelligence Service, that were trying to get into the United Kingdom, live under cover, and report back intelligence. And the best of everybody's knowledge, they caught every one of them. But they had this place called the Lachmer House, which used to be a psychiatric hospital of all things. But they were pretty thoughtful about how they interviewed these people. And some of these men and women had studied for years to have their cover story down. It wasn't just weeks or months. And it's not just they could speak English fluently, but they had very, very detailed and believable cover stories. Once they understood that was happening, they would take one of their best investigators who could really ask good questions and never stop. And they would call him their investigator. And the investigator would just, like, if they told me I was telling about my college years. Oh, really? Okay. And what did you study? Unexpected questions. Who was your favorite professor? Oh, why was she your favorite professor? Did you ever go home with any of your schoolmates for one of the holidays? Where'd they go? I mean, just no matter how long you study a cover story and no matter how detailed it is, it'll never match up to the level of detail of real life, of our real experience. And so there's going to be extents to which your story will only go so far and then it will fall on its face. And that's an exceptional case. In most criminal situations, the the stories, whether they're cover stories or whether they're spontaneously made up, part of a resistance plan, they're going to be finite, whereas our memory of our life experience is, for all intents and purposes, pretty much infinite. And that's why how cognitive interview also helps. So with that, that's a very, very brief overview. I mean, we could teach this over a matter of several days and get into more detail, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for you to ask questions.
Steve, before we turn to general questions, I'm wondering if you could take 2 minutes and talk about the benefit of this type of interview in a slightly different context. That is with, I know a lot of folks have asked questions about dealing with cases where you have an adult who was a child victim and trying to go back and get to the truth of what they remember about what they went through, as opposed to trying to figure out where that memory may have been contaminated or may have been different, but really how can this benefit in those kinds of cases that a lot of the folks on this webinar may be trying to deal with those cases right now?
That's an excellent question, Melissa. Thank you. Again, because cognitive interview goes so far back, and you have all these intrepid researchers, there's people who specialize in crimes involving children, crimes involving people who have some sort of, they're mentally or developmentally incapacitated in some fashion. And these are people, especially the second category, people who are so vulnerable to false confessions. There's a lot of children and people that have some developmental disabilities who are trying their best. And sometimes they're making up the story and adding untrue facts, not because they're trying to evade guilt or something. It's just, that sense for wanting to please the interviewer. And this is sort of a double-edged sword, because the type of interview that uses cognitive interview has to establish a very strong sense of rapport, a sense of an agreement to cooperate on both sides, an openness, a sharing of truths. The interviewer will, like my personal philosophy, and one shared by some of the better practitioners I've known, is everything we say is the truth. We never lie. It doesn't mean we tell you everything that we know, but what we do tell you is absolutely the truth. But the problem is, again, you could establish a depth of rapport where somebody is, and they don't tell you this, they're making up stories to please you rather than to answer your question. They think they're going to disappoint you if they say, well, I don't really remember. The challenge too with adults who are talking about experiences, I mean, this is ideal for that, because it helps people to go back into experiences in a way. And there's been concern here. What about sexual assault, whether adult or child? Is it too traumatizing? Well, as it turns out, no. I mean, and this is looked at from not just cognitive experimental psychologists, but also clinical psychologists. Surprisingly, especially when it's in the context of trying to resolve, put closure on an experience, it's, their memory, they focus on the memories that they can possibly pull from this to add to their understanding, and make sense of things, but also to add to the investigator's ability to understand the situation. So it's, there's slight variations on it, obviously with a child, but as an adult looking back at the child, that's why it's the whole, all the sensory elements are included. Why is that? For example, who here, again on the phone call, has not heard a song that takes them back to the summer between their junior and senior year in high school? I mean, just like that. And you can remember, some event. It's that associative nature. How about a smell? I mean, for me, every time I smell a freshly cut cantaloupe, I can see myself back in my grandparents' kitchen in Eugene, Oregon, where I spent most of my summers as a child. It's just putting these all together helps people to remember that somebody there, there was somebody else that was there. But with the conventional questioning style and the misleading sometimes questioning style, that memory is never accessed. They're never given the opportunity to. So cognitive interview in those cases that you talk about, Marissa, can be enormously helpful.
Great. Thanks, Steve. So for the 25 other people who are on the webinar, we have left some time now for questions, for comments, for whatever y'all want to do. So unless it gets totally out of control, we'll just open it up and folks can jump in.
Back to my ugly.
Unless there are no questions, which I find very hard to believe.
Nobody wants to be the first.
Wow.
Okay. Well, as people gain courage, and Steve, let me jump back in again. You worked on a case with us here in Philadelphia involving an individual who we believed had given a false confession. You were brought in by the DA's office for the Conviction and Integrity Unit. Now, without talking about the details of the case, I'm just wondering if you could share with the prosecutors and the defense counsel what you think your involvement in that case meant, and how what role you played in that, which was an eventual exoneration. Whether that's something you think is a good process to bring you in and consult, or whether that's something that you think the DA could have just done on their own.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, it's self-serving perhaps, but I really think it was a small but important element. I mean, obviously the attorneys were doing all the heavy lifting on this, but I think the cognitive interview should be a standard protocol in these cases, because in this case, this individual was convicted of a homicide with scant evidence. I mean, he even had alibis where he was at work and clocked in, other people saying he'd been there. All they really had was a very problematic eyewitness who at first didn't want to cooperate and at first didn't really have anything to offer, but was apparently pressured to identify this person under very, not the most ideal circumstances to make an eyewitness ID. But taking it back, the key was, our question was not about the crime, which we believed he didn't commit, but more about why is it that he signed that statement? Because the research, I mean, the statistics are disturbing, but the fact is that when a person walks into the courtroom and recants, juries don't believe them, prosecutors certainly don't believe them, and even judges don't believe them. Because they can't understand how why anybody would falsely confess. And that's a whole other hour of discussion, but it's far easier than one can imagine. You're given these questions. Well, imagine, if you will, or maybe you blacked out all these alternative stories over a period of extended periods, hours and hours and hours, and threats, claims of having false information. So the key is trying to find out as much as we could, like in this case, what were the dynamics involved with him signing I think it was a 9-page confession. Keep in mind that he had barely, in fact, he was, in his words, they dropped him out of school in the 9th grade. He wanted to continue. He was struggling, but they didn't want him to come back. And his reading was very, very limited. And he was told when they brought this statement in, you sign this and we'll get you out of here. He just wanted to go home. Like most, we'll get you out of here means, okay, I did what you asked me to do and I get to go home. He never saw the light of day outside of jail for the rest of his life until he was exonerated. So, and he's told the story several times about the interview. And I had him tell me yet again with an open narrative. Then I went into the cognitive interview just the way I've described it. And he was willing to close his eyes, and he was gesturing about where things were and how people came in and out. He kept pointing to the table where the document was. He sort of turned when he was reading it, and he even acted out with his eyes closed. I remember then I was turning the page and turning the page. There's just lots of words on there, and I saw my name. I remember my name was at the bottom left corner. At that point, I just wanted to get out of there. He also brought up that he had told them how drunk he was. And he had somebody who would confirm that how many ounces of beer they had consumed that night before. I mean, they arrested him at 6 in the morning. He was still drunk, so impaired. but there was no interest in that. So it was interesting to look at the volume and the detail, the overall information yield in terms of quantity and quality on a general narrative where you're just letting them talk versus taking them back with a context reinstatement, and increased and added more credibility to his story, added a few small but important details. The key was that they were new. I mean, even to him, I was watching his face when it's like a memory that he hadn't thought of in a long time. But it was important, and certainly it was important to him. So yeah, I think that's very important. And of course, to do as soon as possible if there's a problematic case that you think could end up being a false confession issue. So I mean, but it speaks to another problem, is these cognitive interview techniques within a conviction integrity unit is trying to solve a problem that cognitive interview would have prevented had that type of evidence-driven protocol been used. I mean, and not just that, you saw the model that we teach. The whole idea is to connect with somebody with a great deal of autonomy. It's their choice to talk or not. It's their choice to share or not. But being able to create a situation where when they do want to, they get to tell the story completely. Their memories are enhanced. When there's areas of resistance, we work through it together and to identify what's causing it. And ultimately, we keep going in this cycle, depending on the topic. Freely talking, resist, mitigate the resistance in a way that's respectful, legal, moral, and then moving back into elicitation cycle. So long answer, Marissa, sorry. I think it has a place that should be standard procedure. I think every investigator in a DA's office, especially working these issues, should be supremely well trained and ultimately become recognized experts in the field of cognitive interviewing. I think it would help everybody. And again, the whole idea of help me, what's the term I'm blanking on? When suggesting that people can trust the justice system, procedural justice. It just enhances the whole concept of procedural justice.
And there's a kind of a related question that is being asked from something you touched on. How do you factor in drug use into memory recall? And I'll add in mental health as well into memory recall when doing cognitive interviews, particularly for something that goes back a decade or more?
Well, I guess I'd have to answer that a couple different ways. Like drug use in the intervening years, drug use during the event we're talking about.
I would say drug use at the time of the event, I think is where the question was aimed at.
Yeah, that's going to, that's a very, very thorny question. Yeah, I mean, it literally changes somebody's perception. And it goes back to the idea that if you remember that circle of elements related to memory, one is the experience that you have at the time. And obviously being sober and present and clear-minded, you're going to see and hear and therefore encode a lot more accurate memories than, again, it depends on the type of drug that's being used at the time.
Okay.
But that changes how you interact with your environment.
Would the same answer then apply for drug use in the intervening time between the event and when you're asking them to recall?
Yeah, then it just goes to the nature of it, where there's some types of, I mean, methamphetamine, crack, and some of the others. One simple dose the first time can start to change brain structure in a way that you're addicted for life, short of major intervention. And that could have an impact. But what I will do is I will consult some of my colleagues who really would be able to provide a much more definitive and up-to-date answer on that. I'll pass on to Marissa, and then you can pass on to people.
Sure, and that actually goes to another, a couple folks are asking about websites or publication resources, and I will certainly make those available along with this afterwards. And Steve, I'll get some more from you. Another question that's come through is, obviously in dealing with these cases, we're dealing with a lot of witness recantations, like witnesses who, gave one testimony at trial and now they're giving a different testimony. Is there a particular technique to use in determining whether it was the original narrative or the recantation, which is the more truthful statement? Like, how would you get at to determining, weighing the different veracities of the different statements?
Yeah, well, I would approach it two ways. And unfortunately, so few interviews are recorded. All we have is a transcript, like in the case that we were just discussing, the one that with the recent exoneration. The report and everything he said, he never wrote out his own statement. It was written for somebody else, and it was self-serving, and it often is. It's the details that are recorded, the facts that are included, all will push towards an investigative outcome that's preordained by the detective in many cases. So the key would be for it to be of any real interest, or have any validity. You'd really have to watch an interview of the confession, the false confession, and then compare with going in and interviewing the person about what they are saying is the true story.
Right. And I want to just kind of interrupt a bit because I think the question was more geared toward a fact witness as opposed to a defendant suspect. So if you have a witness who testified that the defendant was at the scene and was involved as a fact witness at trial and now is saying, no, that person was actually not there. I think that's where the question was aimed at. Got
it. Well, see, that's even better because, well, potentially better. You would ask, the only way you could really meaningful approach that is to do a thorough interview of the individual based on the story they're telling now, the one that they say is true. And again, I didn't have time to go into it, but the cognitive interview and other ways, we have ways of creating circumstances that would objectively provide objective indicators that are more indicative of deception or truthfulness. And we could just focus on the revised story alone and sort of make a determination that it's consistent with that it probably is true. Because, for example, one thing, most truthful stories will include verifiable details and things that we could go back and look at and find some trusted source to confirm that it occurred. That's another thing that, again, as an intelligence officer who used to work overseas and live in a cover, if I was ever interviewed by border security and so forth, I always appeared very cooperative, and I would provide all sorts of detail that makes it look like absolutely a true story, but very little in it they could go check. They just, it quote, sounds truthful. And that's what we try to do with our approach to elicitation, is to elicit as many verifiable details as possible, because that is far and away the most reliable way of determining whether somebody is telling you the truth or not.
And that actually dovetails to one of the questions that we have is, what if you're dealing with, and is there any research on this, really, I think is the question. If you're dealing with a culture that comes from a fairly closed approach, that they don't respond well to open-ended questions, but really it's more that they respond better to directed questions. Do you know if there's any research on dealing with cultures of that nature?
Absolutely. A whole important element of the research over the last 10 or 15 years is not just what we know on individual behavior, but how it is impacted by culture. One of my colleagues, Dr. David Matsumoto at San Francisco State University, he's done a lot of work in this area, and especially about culture. He's written college textbooks on culture. I saw him recently, and he was taken aback because I was quoting him actually when I was speaking to a conference, and he was sitting right in there. But it's the idea that culture is so influential that to study human behavior outside of culture is just, he says, is literally meaningless. So we have a number of tactics. You have people in all cultures who are very inarticulate. They're terse for whatever reason. And sometimes they're hiding something. Sometimes that's the way it is. Or sometimes, like you said, it may be a cultural influence. So we can use what has been tested remarkably. It comes from communication theory. It's called a model statement. I will ask somebody and they tell me the story that I want to hear. And it's very, very brief, and there's very few details. First thing, I'll thank them for the cooperation and so forth. And I'll say, it's important for us to explore this as deeply as possible. And I want to give you an example of the level of detail that I would like you to go into for me. This is going to sound strange, but I'm going to tell you about how I start my day. And I want you I'm going to go on for a couple of minutes, but you'll get a sense for the breadth and the depth. And so literally I could do that. I'll say my alarm, usually I set my iPhone alarm, and there's music that comes on usually at 5:45, and maybe I'll press the reset button for another 10 minutes. I'll get up and I go into detail about everything I do. I talk about the timing, I talk about the feeling, like let's say if somebody were, they use mouthwash, it's kind of bracing because that alcohol, but then there's that minty, just going into great detail. And that is remarkable because sometimes people are not being forthcoming because they're being respectful, like a culture that your authority, I don't want to waste your time. You should do the talking, I shouldn't. Then it's amazing the increase in detail that just comes from that. So, oh, you want that, I get it. So that's really, really important. Also, evocation, another of the 5 pillars that we draw from motivational interviewing. Evocation literally means asking questions about somebody's mindset, about their opinions, about their fears, about their concerns. Literally going to your question, I ask questions, and there are a lot of times I get much more detail, and I know it seems like you're being very cooperative, and I appreciate that. But what are you thinking about when you're telling me the story? And they may hesitate. I mean, for example, are you concerned that you're wasting my time? You're just trying to open the door where they can tell you why they're not talking very much. And often there's a legitimate reason that you can work out with them. You can mitigate by just, oh no, hey, you are, all I have to do today is talking to you. Until that's done, I have as much time as you do. So don't worry about that. Get that passed. Oh, okay. And often that mitigates the vast majority of cases like that. Okay. And if people are being very, very hesitant, and you can't, if you're looking for truth, you have to say, I don't know why this person's not talking to me. That's a legitimate professional response. Versus everybody has to have an answer for everything. There's mysteries out there.
Lawyers don't like to hear that. But, and just in terms of time, I do want to just acknowledge that we're past what we had said, but if folks can hang on, and Steve, you can hang on, I do have another question that's come through. Which is really kind of goes to what you were talking about, Steve, in terms of if somebody is giving you answers which you believe are being deceptive. If you believe that the person that you're interviewing is being untruthful, like what do you think are the best mechanisms for confrontation? Understanding that it's not about adversarial processes that we kind of really hardcore confronting, but is there a way to kind of minimize that, or at least get to them to kind of get to the truth? Or is this something that you really only think about in a false confession case, or is this really more about, can it be used in fact witnesses as well? I think that's what I was getting to.
Well, let me add that the cognitive interview was originally designed primarily for witnesses, and then secondarily for victims, and then more recently for suspects. So it's our view, our research and our field studies suggest that whatever protocol is the most effective for eliciting information is one that can be used with slight adaptations to all 3 of those categories of people. And there's not, I don't even believe in the idea of interrogation. I really don't anymore, even though, people label me as that. It's just, intelligence interviewing, investigative interviewing, because you don't know. If I knew the answer, if I absolutely knew the answer, I wouldn't need to talk to this person. And sometimes maybe you have video of the act, okay? But I think the first words out of your mouth should be, help me understand. I think that sets the relationship for, I'm not accusing you of anything. I'm just confessing I'm confused based on 2 pieces of information, maybe 2 pieces of information you provided, or what you provided versus what I've shown you that I have. And just literally help me understand. And sometimes the answers could be identical. A liar says, I've never seen that before. And a truth teller says, I've never seen that before, some document. And they don't recall ever seeing it. So, but the key is always trying to find a way that the communication bridge is wide open, traffic is moving both directions, And it's just help me understand this. How can this and this happen? And then you follow up with more questions. And you think about it, and you can even ask, well, okay, I can see that's possible. Help me. How about I find out more information to prove your point or to back you up? That type of thing. It's you got to move away from the accusation. The accusatory style is just not helpful. It's not helpful at all. At the best, you get the minimal information from somebody who has committed a crime, but you don't know all of it. Who else was involved? And at worst, you've decided somebody's guilty, and you're going to press them until they say yes, or at least give enough information that suggests they're saying yes. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, that's the key. Is it's all about, keep in mind, constructive confrontation. Constructive confrontation. There's the relationship's not going to be lost, and you don't know. I mean, I'll give you an example. I had in Arizona, I was teaching a class, and there was a guy who was being very accusatory because it was a 7-Eleven robbery, and they had the video, and what do you mean, calling them names? We know it's you. He said, what, do I have to bring a video in here? I'll show you it was you. And he said, you have a video of it? Yeah, finally, after arguing back and forth, the guy's saying, you dumb, blah, blah, blah. I know who that was. Who was it? It was my brother. We're twins. And this guy had absolute ironclad alibi. He was not even in the state when it happened. And he didn't like his, there was animosity. But the guy almost didn't bring that up. And he said that later. He said, I could have solved your crime. I almost didn't want to because of the way you were treating me. But had he said, part about it different, because there's another technology called strategic use with evidence, where you present it in a very thoughtful, systematic way that enhances it, but will never, ever cause an innocent person to confess. It just won't, because they always have an answer. But a deceptive, guilty party will get to some point where they're just locked in. I mean, what you said before and this is completely incongruous. It's impossible. So it's keeping that constructive relationship. And that's where it requires people, because, think about the array of crimes out there. Obviously one that comes probably to most people's mind. Could you imagine interviewing a pedophile and part of their story is explaining why they like young children? You can judge them all you want, but you're not going to get the information you need to solve the crime. But you don't agree, you just show acceptance. This is your story, and I really appreciate you telling more about it.
Great.
And, I'm listening completely without judgment. You can go home and want to take several showers afterwards, but that's not the impression you give while you're in front of them.
Right. Great. Okay, well, I'm going to, I don't see any more questions that have been asked, and we have more than kept you past your time, Steve, and I'm very grateful. So thank you again for your time and for working with us. I'm sure that you will be hearing from others on the call afterwards. And we will be making the PowerPoint and this video available for folks once we kind of figure out the mechanisms of all that. And of course, we do have the next webinars in February with the folks from Healing Justice, and I hope everyone can join us for that. But Steve, thank you so much for your time. This has been incredibly valuable for folks, and we're just very, very grateful. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thanks to everybody out there for it. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.